Opposing Viewpoints, White-Collar Crime, Book 2, How Does Money Laundering Occur and What Can Stop It? How does money laundering occur? Money laundering is embedded in Russia's economy by Mark Hudspeth. Banks can be beginning with a quote. The whole idea of money laundering is to make it so complicated that effectively nobody could put together a chart like this. Out of scope with in this viewpoint, Mark Hudspeth writes about money laundering in Russia, a country where the practice is both widespread and a large part of the country's economy. Because of the immense political power that comes with economic significance, most efforts to combat crime and money laundering in Russia comes from outside the country. By working outside the country, these efforts generally involve preventing the money from being further laundered through large purchases in other countries, often in the real estate sector. Mark Hudspeth is a producer for CBS Sunday Morning. As you read, consider the following questions. What does this viewpoint say about the importance of money laundering to the Russian economy?
Number 1. According to this viewpoint, why is individual liability considered one of the most
effective in combating money laundering coming out of Russia, according to this viewpoint?
Because of jail
time. 3. What's the connection between money laundering in Russia and the country's later invasion of Ukraine? Bill Browder, an American-born UK-based businessman, says the war in Ukraine is sharpening the world's focus on Russian President Vladimir Putin. All of a sudden, the world cares about Vladimir Putin's evil, he told correspondent Seth Doan. But that's long been clear to Browder, a Putin target himself. It was while walking in a London park that he received an alarming phone call. U.S. intelligence had learned Browder might be kidnapped and taken to Russia. He recalled, "My safe world in London really evaporated." Browder's decades-long odyssey with the top levels of Russian power started after he moved to Russia in the 1990s to profit from the privatization following the fall of the Soviet Union. Browder's Hermitage Fund soon became the largest foreign investment fund in the country. They researched Russian companies initially to invest. What we discovered was that the oligarchs and corrupt officials who control these companies were stealing all the profits, all the assets out of the companies, Browder said. And so the only way that I felt I could responsibly invest is if I could figure out how they were doing the stealing and then trying to stop them. Not a way to make yourself very welcome in Russia, asked Stone. Well, it was interesting because at the beginning of this moment, Vladimir Putin was fighting with the same guys that I was fighting with, but it turns out that he wasn't trying to end the oligarch era. He just wanted to become the biggest oligarch himself. Browder showed Doan charts laying out the web of elaborate money laundering operations. They helped to uncover the money flowed from the Russian treasury through Moldova to Latvia, then to Switzerland. Said Browder, the whole idea of money laundering is to make it so complicated that effectively nobody could put a chart together like this. Don't ask. It takes an investment guy who's moved to Russia to do this. It takes an investment guy whose lawyer and friend was brutally murdered and has made it his mission for the rest of his life to go after the murderers to do this, he replied. That lawyer and friend was Sergei Magnitsky, who'd been investigating a tax fraud scheme on Browder's behalf. My company paid taxes to the Russian government, said Browder. A bunch of Russian officials seized my documents and then organized and identify theft of my companies and then organized for a $230 million tax refund of taxes that we paid back to those stolen companies so they could enjoy the money. Sergei was a person who figured out the whole $230 million tax rebate fraud. Magnitsky then provided testimony to the Russian State Investigative Committee, but 5 weeks after Sergei testified, the same officials whom he testified arrested him, put him in pretrial detention in Russia, where he was then tortured to get him to withdraw his testimony. Sergei Magnitsky died in a Russian jail in 2009. He was 37 years old. Do you feel responsible for his death? Don't ask. I do. How do you deal with that? I made a vow to his memory, to his family, to myself, that I was going to devote all my time, all my energy, and all my resources to go after the people who killed him, to make sure they face justice, Browder replied. He lobbied for a landmark piece of legislation called the Magnitsky Act. It originally sanctioned people linked to that tax fraud, and Sergei Magnitsky's death, signed into law in 2012, it focused attention on the sort of corruption they'd uncovered. Some of the money from that tax scheme wound up in properties purchased in London, New York, and Dubai. Browder's search for justice was the basis of a best-selling book, Red Notice, now out this week in his latest Freezing Order, published by Simon & Schuster, a division of Paramount Global, which owns CBS. It's the tale of what happened next, a true story of money laundering, murder, and surviving Vladimir Putin's wrath. Don't ask. Some of this sounds like something out of a mob mafia movie. Vladimir Putin is the mafia boss, said Browder. All of his ministers are actually, if you look at The Sopranos, like the New Jersey Mafia and the Brooklyn Mafia, the Philadelphia Mafia. They can all take as much money as they can steal, and they've got to pay tribute to the mafia boss, which is Vladimir Putin. Browder alleges that some of the stolen $230 million ended up in the hands of Putin, a leader infamous for his shadowy wealth. The Russian president's official salary is about $140,000 annually, which raises some obvious questions about his $1.4 billion residence, his $700 million yacht, and his $1 million watch collection. Putin has long maintained Sergei Magnitsky died of a heart attack. His animus toward Browder was clear in his 2018 joint presidential press conference in Helsinki when he suggested to U.S. President Trump that Moscow might be willing to swap 12 indicted Russian military intelligence officers if the Trump administration would turn over Bill Browder to him. I was in shock, Browder said. He has successfully campaigned for other countries to adopt the Magnitsky Act to target corrupt officials and human rights abusers, and Browder was proud that now it's among the sanctions being used to punish Russia since its invasion of Ukraine. The story of Sergei Magnitsky is a tiny microcosm of what's now been multiplied by 1,000,000 times. He said, the people of Ukraine are bearing the criminal brunt of Vladimir Putin in the same way as he did in a very small way, and I feel heartbroken because if people had listened more to what I was saying over the last 10 years, perhaps we wouldn't be in this situation. Here are some of the examples. The low-risk tax fracas. A low-risk tax fracas. That's the first example. Gambling with the devil is the second, and negative news corrupts completely is the third. So let's read these three. A low-risk tax fracas. One client of ABN AMRO, who had been allocating the lowest risk classification, had opened a total of 192 bank accounts with ABN AMRO for 49 of their companies between 2014 and 2018. These accounts were mostly inactive. This client committed fiscal fraud, receiving almost 200,000 euros from the tax authorities on its business accounts. Following transfers to their private accounts with ABN AMRO, most of this money was spent or withdrawn in cash by the client. Despite the various signals and doubts that existed within ABN AMRO regarding this client, the risk classification remained low. The bank did not report unusual transactions to the FIU until the start of the criminal investigation into the client. Gambling with the devil. This is the second example. Another client of ABN AMRO, also with a low-risk classification, was employed in the financial department of a wholesaler. The client had a gambling addiction, had debts, and his account was consistently overdrawn. ABN AMRO was aware of these problems. The client adjusted the details of the funds of his employer's debtors, which resulted in those funds being transferred to his own bank account at ABN AMRO. Over a 9-month period, the amount in excess of 4.3 million euros was transferred to the personal bank account of the client. That money was then almost entirely spent gambling away. ABN AMRO hardly performed client due diligence on this client. The client file turned out to be incomplete, and the deviations from the usual transaction pattern did not generate any alerts in the transaction monitoring system. Negative news corrupts completely. Another example relates to 2 Dutch companies that held bank accounts with ABN AMRO in the period 2010 through to 2017. Payments passed via the accounts of these 2 companies totaling several tens of millions. A corruption case in which companies were supposedly involved was widely covered in
national and international media since 2015. Nonetheless, it took ABN AMRO until March of 2019 to first report to the FIU. It was also found that there were shortcomings in the client due diligence regarding these two companies. And before moving on, there's a study. Is it a charity or a money laundering scheme? Criminals may seek to launder their money through the charity and then receive it clean at the other end. For example, a criminal may make a donation in cash or via online banking, either directly or through an intermediary, in order to place their money into the legitimate financial system and layer it to conceal its illicit source. Donations subject to unusual conditions, for example. Who is this person? Okay, continuing. For example, a criminal may make a donation in cash or via online banking, either directly or through an intermediary, in order to place their money into the legitimate financial system and layer it to conceal the illicit source. Donation subject to unusual conditions, example, a particular individual or organization being engaged to carry out work, unsolicited offers or loans to charities, or a sudden request to return all or part of a donation might be intended to facilitate money laundering. Alternatively, they may set up a beneficiary that appears legitimate but is in fact a front for their criminal activities in order to receive the money once it has been laundered through the charity's bank account. Tricks such as converting the money into a different currency, exchanging money for goods and back again, moving the money through multiple bank accounts across 2 or more jurisdictions, and using the intermediary such as an NGO or a State Department are used to further obfuscate the origin of the funds. Criminals may also seek to obtain tax and other financial benefits from making a charitable donation. For example, a criminal who pays the UK tax on their legitimate activities may seek to take advantage of that fact that those who pay above the basic rate of tax can claim back the difference between the rate they pay and the basic rate of their charitable donation. Having made a charitable donation, the criminal would be able to claim that money back, and it would then be ostensibly from a legitimate source. Criminals may donate money to the charity in exchange for some other non-pecuniary benefit, which is, for example, a professional affiliation that will give their criminal enterprise a veneer of respectability and legitimacy. This quotes The Risks and Penalties of Money Laundering for Charities and How to Guard Against It by Nicola Finnery, Kinsey, Napoli, March 4th of 2021. So, the last subsection of this chapter states, rating agencies not rattled on bank after penalty. While penalties, remediation, and reputational costs for AML failings can feel costly, ratings agencies didn't pillory ABN AMRO, but instead pulled out bright spots seemingly hidden among all of the bad news. For example, even though the identified deficiencies are serious, they largely relate to the period before 2019 launch of the bank's Detecting Financial Crime Comprehensive Plan, according to Fitch Ratings. As part of the mandated remediation and company-wide AML upgrades, ABN AMRO strengthened its IT infrastructure, centralized AML relating controls, and hired a large number of full-time employees, expected to surge to 4,200 this year, double of what it was just a year ago, at a cost of more than $500 million. With the settlement now finalized, the sentiment from industry and outside reviewers is that Dutch authorities have assessed the bank's program, expecting to be fully operational and finalized next year, to be sufficient to restore compliance with the law. As well, on the plus side, the investigation did not find evidence that the bank was systemically involved in suspicious transactions or pursued high-risk customers, according to analysts. In all, Fitch notes that the penalty will cause a small loss in the first quarter of 2021, but don't fret, the seemingly hefty statement-making settlement will be comfortably absorbed by the bank's annual operating profit, which we expect to recover to about Euro 1 billion in 2021 from close to break-even in 2020. Only time will tell if the bank is able to execute on its promises of improvement to craft a culture of compliance that can, as the regulators want, put all the various pieces together. But at the very least, the institution is working on another aspect of compliance, much ballyhooed in the ballyhooed in the United States and internationally a tone from the top. As a bank, we do not merely have a legal but also a moral duty to do our utmost to protect the financial system against abuse by criminals. ABN AMRO CEO Robert Swack said, "In fulfilling this duty, we aim to make a meaningful contribution to the safer society," he said. "Regretfully, I have to acknowledge that in the past, we have been insufficiently successful in properly fulfilling our important role as gatekeeper. This is unacceptable, and we take full responsibility for this." So I would have downplayed it a little bit too, because at least the 3 examples that they gave are not strong. So, number 1, they've got a bunch of inactive accounts that are withdrawing cash for, one client's various 49 different companies. So, if they did enhanced due diligence, maybe they would find that 49 companies is too much for the type of client that they have, and there's a large portion of inactive accounts, which is unusual for the type of business. So yeah, they could do EDD there, and maybe they could find that, and that is all dependent on facts. But as far as gambling with the devil, if a guy is constantly overdrawn and then he has an immediate turnaround in his life and is bringing in $4.3 million over the course of a 9-month period, his profile of going from overdraft to being rich is perhaps one alert, but it's not going to alert you every single time he gets paid if now his new profile is that he's getting large electronic deposits. So I don't even think they did something wrong here. It's not the bank's responsibility to be law enforcement and identify all forms of fraud. This type of siphoning is traceable and can be prosecuted by the party that's been harmed. So, and then the negative news. So, sure, they could have identified and blocked that party's account, but when they say negative news, they're not saying specifically designated national, which you must block. So it's not technically a violation of any money laundering laws. So that's where I think it is tongue-in-cheek that they're saying that they fully appreciate how wrong this behavior is. Because if those are the only 3 things that were being done wrong, then yeah, the penalty is excessive. But when you look at the structural problems that they were talking about, it gives me the idea that more than just these 3 examples were occurring, and they're probably just giving us the lightest of a bunch of other findings that are probably a bit too graphic to share. So, that's my opinion and viewpoint 2 in how does money laundering occur and what can stop it.